Hello and welcome to part 2 of this ec3 lecture on applications of fiscal and monetary policy. So we're looking at Sierra Leone. We've considered some trends in the macroeconomic variables over, say, an 8-year period. And in the next section, called Commentaries on Macro Policy, what I mean by that is I'm going to show you some different types of information that you can find from different sources to try and help you understand what's going on beyond just looking at the raw data and maybe some theoretical models. So let's see where we can get some commentaries from. Now, one really good source that covers every country in the world are the UN agencies, particularly the international financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. So the first thing we're looking at here is the reports on the IMF website from June 2017. You can search by country, you can search by year, you can search by sort of topic. Every country in the world you'll find, developed, undeveloped country, you'll find an IMF commentary. So in June 2017, it turned out that the IMF had made a decision to approve what they call a tranche, a slice of credits to the Sierra Leone government. And if you remember from the graph I showed you, there's the IMF credit or the external credit of various kinds makes a big contribution towards their spending. So it's a big deal for them that they approved. They're going to release some more cash. And they're saying, hey, we expect that this is going to help growth to rise to 7% in the medium term. And remember, growth was struggling a bit, a lower level than that at the time, at the end of that period. It had just recovered from the Ebola crisis. Inflation, we expect, is going to fall to 12%. So inflation was really running away. And so the aims of the program was to carry on this inflation reduction, strengthen domestic revenue, because that's a problem that government spending tends to run ahead of what they can raise themselves, which means they have to rely on grants and so on. Some of the main things are fuel subsidy reform. Sierra Leone, a lot of pressure on the government to subsidise fuel so people can travel and transport their goods around. And mining company revenue. Or clearly, Sierra Leone, well known for its exports of diamonds, and unfortunately, it's quite difficult to tax those diamonds reliably and other minerals. And conversely, we want to use the fiscal space that gives us to allow the government to increase spending on infrastructure, because that's going to help the economy, but also social protection. And so it's showing that it's not just concerned with just the economy, commercial things, it's also the human side, the social protection side, which means things like pensions and benefits for people that get left behind. So, some attractive ideas there, potentially. So what happened? Well, here's some quotes from the report that they're saying that on the fiscal performance fronts, the deficit has been higher than anticipated, 8.3% of GDP. That's the deficit between the government deficit, not the trade deficit. This is because of increased secondary market operations. So basically they're expanding the monetary base, sort of printing money or using secondary market operations to increase the money supply to finance that deficit, which is fine. It covers the deficit, but of course that's putting money in, putting demand into the system, pushing up inflation. So the reserves money, the base money supply, grew by 24%, and inflation was therefore going up at a high rate by the end of 2016, which is what you saw previously. Because this commentary comes at the end, really, of that period I showed you in the charts. They're looking back at that record and saying what's going to happen next, a bit like you would in your essays if you're doing the essay. The fiscal stance, which means the balance of spending and revenue, we envisage a gradual tightening. So we're going to try and pull back the spending by the government and increase taxation to support the expansion of investment that's needed. Then, as well as you can't just cut spending back because you need some investment. So what you need is the other part of that fiscal tightening has got to be increased domestic revenue, increased taxation. So get the budget under control, increase the collection of local taxation, and monetary policy is going to aim at containing that inflation below 10%. That's what they said in June 2017. Okay. A few months later, in September 2017, they came back and found that, okay, oh dear, projected growth has fallen from 6.3 to 5.6. So it doesn't look as though they're going to make the growth targets. Inflation has risen instead of fallen. Another target missed. And instead of raising government revenue, lower than expected government revenue and aid receipts. So both the government's revenue from its own tax collection and what they're getting in terms of grants from overseas, both fallen, which is going to push the government deficit up. And then the current account deficit, the trade deficit, had also risen to over a fifth of GDP. So September 2017 wasn't looking good. What is the government minister? Like, this is the second and really great source of information. Every government in the world, they publish their budget, usually a budget speech by the chief finance minister, and very, very often they're available in English, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, often in English. Latin America tends to be in Spanish. Asian countries often in their languages, so harder to access, but really good source of information. So here's the budget speech from October 2007 by the Finance and Economic Development Minister, Mahmoud El Kagbo. And he's saying, the title was Strengthening Resilience for Inclusive Growth. He says the government's record is one of impressive growth and a stable macroeconomy. Well, you can judge for yourself by looking at the graphs and what the IMF said, but that's an interesting interpretation. It says the problems are due to external shocks. Commodity price fell. Well, that figures because we know that exports were going down. So yeah, commodity price fall, lack of external demand and internal demand. Yeah, we know these guys were hit badly by Ebola and also a series of floods. So those are really quite believable explanations for what happened. Spending better aligned with revenue. Well, there's some sign in the charts that government spending came down a bit. It's true. Inflation coming down. Yeah, not what the IMF said, not what the data seems to say. Need for infrastructure and pro-poor spending. Yeah, most observers agree with that. Need for spending on these important areas. Yeah. So the government sets out what's been happening, what the plans are for revenue collection and spending. It carries on the. I can't remember where. I keep saying extenuating circumstances fund, but it's not. It's like this is the name of the tranche of credit that the IMF gave them, which I've got in my notes somewhere. I can't remember what it's called. So the main aims of this IMF loans facility they're extending to us is to help. They're lending us the money in order to help us improve our tax collection, tax activity monitoring, collection, enforcement operations, to help us plan better fiscal sustainability without getting into deficit, and to use that money to stimulate medium-term growth by improving infrastructure and training and so on. So we're planning aggressive revenue mobilisations. It's still budget speech. No new taxes or raised levels of tax. So it's okay. That kind of contradicts the bullet point before. So instead of putting new taxes, they're going to emphasise closing loopholes. So we don't need new taxes. The taxes are already there. We're just going to make sure people pay those taxes. That's what they're going to do. The reason he's saying is that with the exception of the UK and US, the advanced economy outlook is good. And of course they're saying that because that's the outlook for their demand for exports is good. Unfortunately, because imports are getting more expensive as well, that drives up prices of rice and fuel, and that then has knock-on effects on internal production prices and pushes up inflation, as well as driving the current account deficit. And here they're sort of comparing themselves to other sub-Saharan African countries, saying that in the average in sub-Saharan Africa is that domestic revenue is usually about 17% of GDP. In our country, it's 5 percentage points lower than that. So we're not raising as much tax as other comparable countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is that effectively what we're doing is, he's sort of saying it's an urban bias, that we're subsidising urban consumers at the expense of people in the rural areas who are producing the rice. Because we're trying to keep rice down and subsidise that, prices down, but that means that the farmers that are growing it are not being rewarded. We're subsidising fuel, but that means that expenditure is going on people that are able to travel, and it's pushing up inflation, and it's not helping our deficits. So despite the huge price increase in the oil imports, the price that people are paying at the pumps has stayed the same. So the difference is being made up by subsidy from the state coffers, which could be going to something else. So the government says these things, but they didn't say that they're going to change it. There's nothing in the speech about changing either of those things that I can find. So they recognise the problem, but they can't change it for some reason. Back to IMF, the resident report later on, so the next year, February, they decided to withhold that ECF tranche. They're not going to pay. Oh, so there's the ECF, Extended Credit Facility. They're not going to pay the next stage of the Extended Credit Facility because the government, the Sierra Leone government, hasn't fulfilled their conditions. They haven't fulfilled their bargain in terms of raising revenue for the domestic economy, so the IMF's not going to match it with the ECF. So it would have been quite attractive, 0% interest, no repayments, 10 years to maturity at a low rate of interest. So the steps to be taken didn't seem to be working. So that was a blow. Okay, third source of good information. You can get reams and reams of government policy announcements, including the budget speech, all sorts of other things. But in many countries, you can also get what other voices are saying. So here in Sierra Leone, we're coming up to, I think it's coming up to elections of 2019, I think. Anyway, the opposition were clearly criticising this. So you can find things in the newspapers and elsewhere. This is from the Sierra Leone Telegraph, from the chief opposition candidate for presidency. So he's saying, these tax exemptions, the tax exemption, so the amount of tax that people were let off, was almost as much as the actual amount of revenue they collected. So almost half, or almost 100% of what was collected was also let off. And it was as big as all development aid. So if we only collected the stuff that we're owed by our domestic people that are dodging tax somehow, that would be as much as all of the aid we're given. Another acronym I've lost, GST. So we're losing about 240 million because of all these exemptions. If you elect me as the next president, I will change all of that. I'll make sure all these loopholes are filled and we raise the revenue from these people that are dodging taxes and use it for our development. Other voices, there are these really interesting advocacy networks which are run by Sierra Leoneans, but they've also got people in the diaspora around the world that are working at universities and businesses and other areas that help to keep up these online networks. And you can find similar things for other countries. So these really good some of these things here are about other West African countries as well, and other international diasporas looking at different countries. But you can find commentaries such as this one from the Budget Advocacy Network. He's saying, as we agreed that in more taxation, we need better, more effective taxation. There was this big thing of a really good-looking deal, whereas a big Sierra Leone, a big South Korean company was going to build a complex in the city, but even though they were bringing a lot of investment, they wanted big tax exemptions for it. And the South Korean government was anxious to go ahead with this, but it was against the Sierra Leone revenue law to do this, because it would just be another example of big investors coming in and not actually paying the taxation they should pay. So what should the government do? Does it say, we can't give you tax exemptions because we really desperately need to raise tax, in which case the South Koreans won't invest, or do they let them invest, in which case the government deficit gets bigger? Then you can get loads and loads of commentaries in the media. Here's like the Sierra Leone Standard Times, quite a prestigious Sierra Leone paper, spent more on tax giveaways than all its development priorities. Mining firms, particularly the diamond mining firms, biggest beneficiaries. The tax exemptions, they would have paid for 8 times the whole health budget or 7 times the whole education budget. So you're forgiving enormous amounts of tax. Losses from the GST waivers, from the mining company waivers, so this is taxes that wasn't charged to the mining, was far more than was actually collected. So they paid less than half the tax they should have paid. And you don't have to stay within Sierra Leone. This is the Joburg Times, South Africa. So there's some really good newspapers in places like South Africa. There's big good business newspapers in Nigeria, Kenya, you can refer to, that cover other African countries. So they're saying that looking at the political economy level of this, so how much should the state do something, how much should the market do something, neither of these two things would seem to work in this situation. The former, so direct state control of the diamond mines, that's just too expensive to enforce in terms of taking over the mines. But on the other hand, allowing the mines to be run by purely private actors and then taxing them is really hard, because it's so difficult to tax people. And the government's has proved that it's incapable of taxing, because it's so difficult to monitor who's exactly doing the mining. because it's non-excludable. It's difficult to exclude people. Non-excludable means it's difficult to make sure that people that haven't paid their tax are not capable of getting in on the mining business. So, as a conclusion, we've got the government, the IMF, opposition, civil society. They all agree that the important thing for Sierra Leone to do is to raise domestic revenue. And it's not like, oh, Sierra Leone's very poor, it can't afford it. There is this very lucrative diamond business going on. There are big investments going on. There's the fuel taxation, which is not being done. So there's a lot of tax revenue there that could be taken, but it's enough to substitute all that aid, to achieve their development priorities, and to fill the government's deficit. But they can't do it, despite the fact that all these different commentators from different points of view are saying this is what they should do. It's hard to do it, like the important example of diamonds. So diamonds are really hard because there are big, powerful actors involved, and it's hard to really make sure that people that haven't paid their tax are not then somehow able to get involved in the diamond trade anyway. And also there's tremendous political pressure from the urban elites to maintain those subsidies on fuel and food. So if you cut the fuel and food subsidies, you lose political support. And this all means that the deficit stays big, the government's got no fiscal headroom, it's really hard for it to address other macro targets as well. So it's hard to keep down inflation, it's hard to promote pro-poor per capita growth. IMF credit, if the IMF could fill that gap, then that could give them more fiscal space to address these other targets. But again, the IMF has withheld that credit because of the missing revenue targets. So is this just a vicious circle that inevitably attracts in this situation that you've got low income means you can't raise money, means that you miss your targets, means you don't get the loan, means you can't raise money? Or is it just the internal political economy that the powerful actors within Sierra Leone, the urban elites, the people that have got control of the mines, they're just too powerful for the government to effectively tax them? So it's an effective internal political economy. So if the government tried to tax those people, they'd just lose power, and the government would replace them. Because it would be very interesting, the opposition person, if they came to power, would they really have to be able to do anything different? So hopefully that showed you that by looking at IMF, World Bank, that kind of multinational organisation, looking at government budget speeches, which you can always find, looking at statements by the opposition, looking at statements in the media, looking at these international networks, you can get a rich amount of data which can really help you bring to life, just looking at some graphs and what's happening here, or some macroeconomic theory. You can say, okay, what's really going on in this country? What means that, okay, yes, okay, in theory, increased taxation, reduced government deficit, but when you're confronted by this array of political forces, then it's not as easy as that. Okay, so in the next one, we'll bring back in some macroeconomic theory and look at how we can use macroeconomic theory to analyse some different policy situations. But for now, thanks for watching.